Hey, how's it going?
Hi, how are you?
Not bad.
Hold on a second. Just trying to get set up here.
Take your time.
Let's see. Am I visible?
Not yet. You need to turn on your camera.
Start video. Oh,
Ah,
okay.
there you go. Hey, how's it going?
Hi. And am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Amazing.
That microphone works really well. So it's been a while.
So, yeah, please.
Yeah.
Just talking to my wife.
It's how's Arizona? How's the Arizona weather?
Right now, the weather's beautiful. It's kind of not too hot, hasn't gone over 100 yet. Not too cold. It's not going below freezing.
That's a good range.
It's very dry, very pleasant.
That's good. I need that. I'm liking the beard, by the way. I see you made it a lot bigger.
In
I'm liking the beard.
the beard.
Yeah.
Well, that was by accident. I was stuck in bed for a month.
Oh, well, it looks good. I guess I suggest you keep it.
I figured save a few minutes every morning.
There you go. Well, what do you think of mine, by the way?
Well, I always wanted, one of the high moments of my life was in first grade when I played Moses in a school play with a nice white beard. Always wanted to go back to that.
Oh, now you got the natural one. Do you have any tips for me with keeping your beard?
Just every once in a while, my wife gets sick of it and cuts some of it off. But other than that, nothing.
All right. Well, I thought it would be nice to connect, and you were right. What you said is that we'll have a lot to talk about in March, and it looks like there is a lot. Um, there always is.
Unfortunately, there's always a lot.
Yeah. So I figure everyone's always asking you sort of the same questions. I wanted to talk in this sort of conversation about capitalism as such and how it can affect our free speech and how it can have an effect on journalism and so on. And
Wish I had more time, but I have another interview coming along in half an hour. So let's see what we can do.
let's see what we could do. I'll try to cut it into clips later and send it to you.
Very rushed.
Yeah.
Ever
So,
since
okay. So I'll try to keep it to the point. So first of all, let's set the stage. So you wrote Manufacturing Consent. This was what, like 40 years ago now, 50?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Late
And
80s.
in it, you had five, well, I'd let you tell it. You had five points, right, of how journalism is captured by the government.
We did modify it in 2002. We had a second edition and changed the fifth filter. It was too narrow, so broadened it. No other changes.
Right, you changed. So the fifth filter went from basically communism to Islamism or terrorism or something of that nature. So basically, first I wanted to just say, interestingly, I found that in the last, since 2016 to 2020, the MAGA Republicans seemed to almost go past you in their distrust of the media. So 40 years ago, the liberals and people on the left, like yourself, were distrusting media as a mouthpiece of the government. Somehow, through Trump's term, the people on the right were saying that even though they were in power and government, that the media was actually kowtowing to the Democrats and so on. So what do you make of that? That the MAGA Republicans were almost more distrustful of media than yourself?
Well, what's happened since, Republicans have always had overwhelming control of the media, the mainstream media, the owners, the advertisers, mostly it's all business, closely connected with the government, which is closely interconnected with the even dominated by the business world. But when you own the world and you have only 90% control of something, it looks like you don't have any influence. You have to have 100% control. But we see this very often. So the very interesting moment was the switch from the sort of regimented capitalism of the New Deal period up through the 60s on to what became the neoliberal program of pretty much uncontrolled capitalism, limited control. And if you look at the documents in between there, they're very revealing. So one of them, famous one, is the Powell Memorandum, a memorandum written by a right-wing lobbyist, corporate lawyer, later became a justice of the Supreme Court under Nixon. He wrote a memorandum to the American Chamber of Commerce, and which is very interesting reading. He said, business is in trouble. Business is being attacked all over the place. Everyone hates us. The media hate us. The universities are indoctrinating people to hate us. We've just lost everything. We're being under constant attack. He says, it's strange because we have the money. So how are we allowing this to happen to us? We have to have a counteroffensive to use our money to try to get a little bit of exposure in the media and the universities and so on. I mean, when you read it, it's comical. It's like a 3-year-old kid, spoiled 3-year-old kid who has all the toys except one. You know, his younger brother took that one toy, so he's in total despair. I have to have all of them. The idea that business was under attack is so ludicrous that you don't even know whether to laugh. But it had a big effect, and it was part of a major effort by the corporate sector to try to take back almost complete control, not just 90%, but everything. And then you move on to the neoliberal era. And It's the same kind of complaint. Like the regents at Yale University claim that the university is being taken over by woke liberals. Conservatives don't have a voice and so on. When you take a look at what's done there, you don't even know whether to laugh or cry. I mean,
all right. So you kind of feel that
same with the media. The mainstream media are basically centrist. But there are other media, like say talk radio, which is rabid far right. I mean, beyond description. People like Rush Limbaugh were reaching 20, 30 million people a week, and Fox News came along, far right, But,
well, that's what I wanted to kind of discuss with you. So the last 20 years, I wanted to pose a thesis to you that I personally subscribe to, but I see this happening, and I want to get your take on what could have been happening. So first of all, I think two major things happened in the last 20 years. One is that the internet has disrupted the traditional journalism, like the Walter Cronkite and the New York Times editorial desk and so on. And journalists had to adapt. So because we run a for-profit enterprise, the news organizations typically run as for-profit, or they have to pay their employees. So they adapted by essentially creating more biased and more clickbaity articles, and nothing sells like outrage. So my thesis is that the news media, by being profit-driven, it's the capitalist system selected for the news media that doesn't tell both sides of the story. So for example, if you're listening to the Daily Kos or you're listening to the National Review, on different sides of the aisle, they need to lock in a loyal audience And if they tell both sides of a story, then the story will seem like no big deal. Like, oh, I see what happened there. It's not really a newsworthy story in the first place. So I think that the character of news was shaped by the need of journalists to adapt in the era of blogs and independent media, essentially. What do you think of that?
Question arises, what does both sides mean? Actually, in the United States, both sides means centrist to far right. It's a little different. I should say the things have changed in some ways. Like take the New York Times. It has columnists now who are pretty far to the left, which never would have been permitted in earlier years. It's opened up in that respect. And that's, I think, the effect of it's a long-term effect of the activism of the 60s, which did civilize the country considerably under tremendous resistance. Powell memorandums, just one of many examples. But it had an effect on a lot of young people who grew up in that period, just have different views and different attitudes. Many of them have worked their way into the media, and it's had an impact. So there's still the kinds of institutions they used to be, major corporations owned by bigger corporations which sell a product to a market. The market is advertisers, product is readers, and totally closely linked to government, strongly linked to the indoctrination system in the universities. So it maintains its basically sort of centrist conservative cast, but changes.
Well,
There
yeah,
are things that you didn't hear before,
I,
and that's quite different. But so it's a mixed story, I think.
I
Actually,
very much think it is a mixed story. There's so many views that I see in today's America with libertarians and on the left and on the right. There are, if you can believe it, some libertarians on the left as well, although they're few and far between. There's also different progressives and people, conservatives. I would even argue that you're absolutely right. In the 60s, the free love movement and all of the civil rights movements and everything liberalized society to a great extent, to the point where I would say today's so-called right-wing, let's say Republicans like Ben Shapiro would be considered liberals in the 50s when it comes to sexual and racial and other norms. I would say that they would be looked at in the 50s as liberals, which is, I'm talking about just the social sphere, not the economic.
but remember that what is called left liberal in the United States is basically centrist. There are a few voices that go beyond, but not much. The general picture is keep to the doctrinal, within the doctrinal system. You can see it in case after case. Take, say, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, the kind of left liberal columnists in the New York Times would say his programs are very good, but they're too radical for the American people. So can't implement them. And what are his programs? Actually, one of the leading columnists, associate editor of the Financial Times in London, world's major business journal, Rana Foroohar, really recently had a column in which he was saying, only half in jest, that if Sanders was in Germany, he could run on the Christian Democratic program policy, the right-wing program. What are his policies? Universal health care. Who doesn't have universal health care?
The United States.
Everybody. That's too radical for the American people. Free higher education everywhere. Mexico, Germany, Finland, Brazil, wherever you go.
Right.
No, that's what's called the left in the United States. This is too radical for the American people. Or take a foreign policy. Take another one, which kind of interesting, which appeared yesterday. Interesting article by one of their lead foreign policy commentators, Stephen Lee Myers. I happened to have a conference yesterday with representatives from many Latin American countries. And I just out of curiosity, read a paragraph from his column in it. They just burst out laughing. I don't have the exact words, but it was something like this. It was about how China is challenging the liberal international order established by the United States, which is based on rule of law, support for democracy, and support for human rights. You read a phrase like that to anybody in the global South, they burst out laughing. That's the United States, the country, the only country that's been condemned by the World Court for and basically international terrorism, and of course rejected it. The country that has overthrown government after government, that invades any other country it wants to, that imposes, the only country in the world that can impose brutal sanctions that murder tens of thousands of people. That's the country that established the liberal order rule. People just laugh, but in the
Well, that's
United
certainly
States,
that's
that's
certainly the party line, I think, in the United States. But every country thinks of itself as liberating. I think the Soviet Union said that they were liberating the world from imperialists because they were.
see, but some countries, we are able to look at them and say that's a joke. Okay, so when Russia talks about its brilliant, its marvelous Stalin constitution, which had all sorts of wonderful things in it, we don't even bother laughing. But you're right, every imperial power in the past has been very much like us. When the French were slaughtering people in Algeria, they were, the intellectual classes were talking about the civilizing mission. When England was carrying out horrible atrocities all over the world, its leading intellectuals, even people like John Stuart Mill, were praising England as an angelic power, so marvelous others can't understand it. That's pretty normal. But the inability to look at there were exceptions. People like Adam Smith, for example, who bitterly condemned what he called the savage injustice of the English in their destruction of India. But they're pretty rare. Most of the intellectual classes, the educated sectors, just repeat the propaganda. But
I think history is repeating itself. And I just thought, since we have about 15 minutes, I wanted to talk about the present and kind of break new ground maybe with this conversation a little bit. So the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about is how capitalism affected the journalism industry. And like I said, I think they needed to adapt to create a product. If the users are the product that they're selling to the advertisers, let's say, then they need to get a lot of users, or as they say, engagement and clicks and visits. And so not even the New York Times is immune to this. They change their titles, in real time based on how well they're received. And so one thing is, what if you asked what could be both sides? So one thing, I wanted to share my screen and kind of show you what both sides could look like. And I'm thinking about the difference between competition, a competitive system like we have today based on profit and Wall Street earnings, and on the other hand, collaboration, things that they do in science, for example, with peer review and so forth, things that they do with the open source movement, code commits, and the things that they do in Wikipedia, where they essentially have a talk page and they duke it out before the public gets to see the final result. So what I wanted to the first question I have for you is, what if we had a nonprofit news media that was more like Wikipedia, where each person has one of these? They have a phone. These days, you don't need to send intrepid journalists into war zones necessarily, because people are already in them. And if we don't know, for example, whether, to take an example, Assad gassed his own people, or whether it was the rebels, or what happened, we may not know. Why do we leave it up to the for-profit journalism and media to decide what the story, how to digest the story for us, when we can have motley assortment of people with many different views on a topic converge on something like a Wikipedia talk page, and the end result would reflect all the criticisms, serious criticisms that were brought up. It might be a slightly slower process. It might take a day to come out, but I would argue it would be healthier for society, and people wouldn't be as divided into echo chambers because they would see both sides of multiple sides of every argument. That's what I mean by both sides, essentially.
I don't agree with that notion of both sides. I mean, there are many sides. You look at the mainstream media, both sides mean centrist to far right. There's other things that don't make it. We could go into it. The Wikipedia model, whatever you think about it, there's some good things in Wikipedia. If you want to learn about quantum physics, medieval history, classical Greece, good articles. You want to look about current things, very different. A lot of problems with it. Groups that organize to try to get their own views massively through, they tend to dominate, and others don't. There's plenty of problems, but it's not a news medium. It doesn't have bureaus all over the world reporting. It doesn't have editors who it doesn't have the whole structure that enables media to function. It doesn't have advertisers. That means it's not going to be able to compete in the marketplace. Now when you say that advertisers want to reach a broad public, it's only partially true. So suppose that say ExxonMobil realizes that they can reach a broad public as they can by saying, okay, we're going to close down our fossil fuel production, and we want to support moves to renewable energy. Suppose an article comes out like that. Is ExxonMobil going to support it? They've got a large audience that way, but that's not the message they want. We might remember an observation of George Orwell's, brief observation, but he did discuss the question of media in free societies, his introduction to Animal Farm, which most people don't read because it was suppressed. But
okay,
many years later, it's addressed to the people of England. He says, this is a satire on the totalitarian enemy, but don't feel too self-righteous about it, because in free England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And one of the mechanisms he discusses is the media. Brief comment, he says the media are owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not seeing certain ideas at present.
Well, that's what I am talking about. I'm saying that a media that is owned top down as a pyramid by, let's say, News Corp, Rupert Murdoch's company.
Who's funding it?
So I actually wanted to show you my screen. I wanted to show you an example where so-called free speech under capitalism, it looks like this. There's news anchors, local stations, that essentially say the same talking points word for word because they were bought by Sinclair Television. And of course, we tend to associate free capitalism or free enterprise with free speech. But if you are hired or fired based on what you say, and essentially it looks like this, I wanted to just, I don't know, one moment, I apologize. I just wanted to have you hear this. Here we go. For example, this is what it looks like. They made a montage.
As 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about
word for word, they are saying the same thing, and there are dozens of stations, local stations. You could say propaganda in some way because the message is being, they're just mouthpieces, the people saying what they are. So my contention is that this will not produce necessarily the free speech or the robust discourse that society needs in order to evaluate different issues, essentially. What do you say to that?
I mean, take a look at talk radio. If you go back to the 60s, there was talk radio, not anything like the scale today, but it was actually pretty broad. It had a range of, nothing like today, it had a range of what they call them, talk masters, liberal, conservative, libertarian, left, others. All, by now it's all changed radically to what you just described. It's all extreme far right. The stations were bought up, bribed, other things. I mean, I could give you particular examples from my own experience of where independent radio stations were blocked by pressures from advertisers and management just not to discuss certain things. If they did it, they'd go out of business.
Right.
Some of the pressures are subtle. You know, it's just not the kind of thing you say. Okay, it's not an advertiser comes in and hits you over the head with a mallet. It's just understandings. You know, it's just not the nice kind of thing to talk about and so on. In fact, going on with Orwell, who's well aware of this, is that one of the ways in which you get indoctrination and control is just by being immersed in the dominant culture. You go to the best schools and so on, have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things you just wouldn't do to say. Okay, so you don't, if there's a Gallup poll, an international Gallup poll, on which happens to ask the question, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? And it turns out overwhelmingly the United States. Nobody else is even visible. You just know that's not the kind of thing you report. Nobody has to tell you. So
well, that's exactly why I feel that the content of the news is modeled after the system that produces it. Here, I want to show you sort of Wiki News. Okay, this is an example of a site where the news is edited collaboratively by people. And you can see almost on the, even on the front page, the selection of news is very different, perhaps, than what you would expect in a for-profit newspaper. A lot of the things that you might read about in Africa, you might not even know about. Here, for example, 23rd Italian ambassador to Congo. Now, what I'm saying is, here's a collaboration tab, which is essentially similar to the talk page on any Wikipedia site. And what happens is people have different complaints, different issues with the article. Is this done? Is this sourced properly? And so on. And I'm saying that I think having the collaborative tab in the open like this will enable this sort of rough draft to be prepared so that when the final article comes out, the people aren't necessarily fed only one side. And I want to compare that to something like Twitter, okay, something like Facebook, because it's not just about the companies that produce the news articles, the journalists, if you will, or these days it's also the independent voices. You know, yourself, you've been active for decades, but now there's people on the left, on the right, everywhere with their own channels on YouTube, million subscribers. People like David Pakman and Kyle Kulinski, David Dole are on the left as well. Now they have a robust sort of bread to YouTube, some of which are openly socialist and even criticize the establishment, just capitalism itself. Here, I wanted to just make a stark comparison. On the one hand, you have a collaborative platform where no one has any profit motive and doesn't necessarily gain anything, but also doesn't spend a lot of effort going to a country and writing an article and editing and so forth. Everyone does a small contribution. On the other hand, you have things like this in Twitter, where if you go and look at the trending things and you know, Godzilla versus King Kong advertisement, and then you've got Trump, let's say, to 50,000 people. Well, he's the president, but you also have other people who are not politicians able to send an unfiltered tweet at 3 in the morning to 5 million people. And so my question is, when it comes to free speech, certainly people should have freedom of speech. But I feel like these privately owned platforms that were built by Mark Zuckerberg and others are still being privately owned and managed today. And people expect too much of them. And one quick thing I just wanted to show you and then ask you the question is that we had two things happen just recently. We had a Senate hearing literally 2 days ago on their concern about a free and diverse press. I just want to play 30 seconds of that for you. This is bipartisan.
Valuable content to the detriment of broader society, which quote, can lead to wider social, political, and cultural harm through the decline of authoritative and reliable news media, the resultant spread of fake news, and the decline of the local press, which is often a significant force in sustaining communities, end quote. With that in mind, today's hearing is an opportunity to examine solutions to this urgent problem. Earlier this week, I reintroduced the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act with Ranking Member Buck.
This act that he refers to is introduced by Senators Klobuchar and John Kennedy, and also representative in the House of Representatives. The thing is, they're trying to use more competition and more capitalism to solve the problem, but they recognize that a problem exists. My question to you is, what if there was a site where essentially, like this one, for example, that like Wiki News, that could actually make a collaborative discourse, and then people would be exposed to the result the same way that scientific journals do peer review before they push the science on everybody else, because people don't have the tools to fact check everything. What if there was no profit motive, and what if it was run like scientific journals, if we ran the news that way? What do you think of that, essentially?
Certainly in favor of diversifying sources. We actually have something like that. It just isn't one source, it's a variety. So you can turn to Democracy Now! And hear a lot of things you'll never find in the mainstream media. You can look at Truth Out, Common Dreams, other sites, again, lots of things that aren't there. What you're suggesting, if I understand, is let's make this more collaborative. That's fine, but you still are not going to be able to overcome the fact that there is a radical maldistribution of power. All of this news comes from somewhere. It's coming from the major centers that gather news, like the New York Times, for example. That's, they and a few others where the information is coming from which all this is selected. Now, in the internet era, you can pick up foreign news, but this is a chore. And it's going to turn out that most of the population, which doesn't have endless time available, will go to the immediately available sources. And they're going to be skewed towards where power lies. Now, there's no way to deal with this within the information system. It's a problem of the society. As long as you have radical maldistribution of power, you're going to have overwhelming control by centralized power on the political system. Doesn't matter what laws you pass. You're going to have overwhelming power over the major media. These are things that have to be dealt with at a deeper level than finding methods like these, which are good ones. I think it's a good idea, but these are always going to be subordinated to the enormous concentration of power within the economic system, which affects everything. Can't be stopped by laws or by devices. You can modify it, you can mitigate it, you can offer better means for people like this. That's all to the good. But we should recognize the limitations as long as we're living in a not really capitalist, but a state capitalist system with high concentration of power in private hands. That casts an overwhelming effect over the whole society. John Dewey put it pretty well when he said that big business casts its shadow over all of society, and you can't really have democracy as long as that's the case. Well, that's a limitation that goes deep.
Well, Noam, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, I would love at some point, let's do this again about decentralization of power, because I have a lot to say about it. I just want to say I don't just interview people. I've interviewed Thomas Greco, community currency economist, also for decades. He's been studying and saying much of the same things as you. It would be great to get both of you guys on. But I just want to say, over the last 10 years, I've been actually building solutions and trying to build these solutions myself, as you know, to some extent. So I'd love to have maybe a longer conversation sometime. And I would love to ask you what you think of the stuff that may work.
These are very interesting ideas, but we have to recognize the constraints that exist by the deeply undemocratic nature of the society, which is very hard to get around within a private enterprise system. You can limit it, you can mitigate it, but like Dewey said, it's always going to cast the shadow over everything. Well, hope we can go on someday. Sorry, it's tight.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I'll send you this video. Talk to you later.
Talk to you.
Bye.